Alex Reed's car came to a slow stop in front of the Victorian house, its faded blue shutters and ivy-covered walls casting an old-world charm. The town was quiet, still nestled in that morning fog that softened the edges of everything. It was precisely the escape he needed, a small, quaint town where people kept to themselves and life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. As he carried his boxes into the house, Alex felt a calm settling over him, a stark contrast to the city life he'd left behind. Here, he'd focus on his teaching, perhaps find solace after a difficult breakup, and maybe even start fresh. The house was perfect for a history enthusiast like him, full of creaky floorboards and outdated wallpaper, and that indescribable charm old houses seemed to radiate. On his first night, Alex curled up on his couch with a book. The quiet was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. But as the evening wore on, he began to notice the sounds. Creaks from the floor, a subtle tapping in the walls, and, barely audible, a faint sound that made him sit up, listening closely. It was easy to dismiss as house sounds, though a subtle chill ran down his spine. Still, he ignored it, telling himself it was the quirks of an old house. Turning off the lights, he headed to bed, allowing the stillness to settle over him. But as he drifted to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't entirely empty. Days passed, and Alex settled into the routines of his new life. He started his job at the local school, met a few colleagues, and began forming a predictable rhythm. However, the nights grew less peaceful. The faint sounds persisted, and each evening they seemed to grow more distinct, a soft, almost rhythmic sobbing that ebbed and flowed. One night, as he lay in bed, the sound grew louder. Alex strained to make sense of it, his pulse quickening. He sat up, waiting for it to stop, but instead, it seemed to shift, as if moving beneath the floor. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, but his mind refused to let it go. Finally, in a bid for answers, he reached out to Maggie Wilson, his elderly next-door neighbor. She welcomed him with a warm but knowing smile, her demeanor both friendly and cautious. Over tea, he asked her about the house's quirks, mentioning the strange sounds. Maggie's smile faded. "The house is old," she said, her gaze distant. "It holds on to things, memories, sounds." Curious, Alex pressed her further, but she only gave him a quiet warning. "Some things are best left undisturbed, Alex. Not every sound in that house wants to be heard." The warning unsettled him, but it also fanned the flames of his curiosity. That night, the sobbing seemed even louder, and for the first time, he felt certain he wasn't alone in the house. His heart pounded as he lay there, torn between ignoring the sounds and confronting whatever was lurking beneath. Alex couldn't shake the thought of Maggie's words. Not every sound in that house wants to be heard. He tried to focus on his daily routine, but the eerie sobbing continued to haunt him each night. It was always subtle, just enough to remind him that something, or someone, was still there. One evening, as the sounds grew louder and seemed to drift closer, Alex decided he'd had enough. Flashlight in hand, he descended into the basement, determined to find the source. The air grew colder as he moved further into the dark, stale space. Dust coated every surface, and a faint, musty smell filled his nose, clinging to his clothes. Scanning the area, his flashlight beam swept over an old, half-hidden door embedded in the floor, a trapdoor he hadn't noticed before. Its edges were uneven, as if hastily patched over. Alex knelt down, feeling a shiver crawl up his spine as he traced the worn wood with his fingers. He tugged at the latch, only to find it immovably locked. His pulse quickened. This was where the sound seemed to be coming from. He spent the next few days trying to find a key or any tool to pry the door open. The townspeople, however, offered no help. Each inquiry was met with vague looks and reluctant shrugs, as if they knew something but were unwilling to share. When he mentioned it to Ben, his only friend at the school, Ben brushed it off. "Alex, it's probably just the house settling. It's an old building, right?" But Alex knew this was more than that. His growing obsession with the trapdoor had him checking it nightly, pressing his ear against it to listen. And each night, The sobbing grew more distinct, the rhythm more pleading, filling him with a dread he couldn't explain. Unable to ignore his curiosity, Alex returned to Maggie, hoping for answers. This time, he was more direct, asking her about the trapdoor. Maggie's face paled as he mentioned it, her hands trembling slightly as she set her teacup down. "There are things best left alone, Alex," she whispered, her voice quivering. "That house, it's seen things. And some things don't rest, even after all these years." But Alex pressed further, insisting that he needed to understand what was happening. Maggie's shoulders slumped, a weariness settling into her expression as she looked at him. "Years ago, before you were born, that house belonged to a man named Harold Cartwright. He was peculiar, kept to himself. People say he had a family, but no one ever saw them. One night, he disappeared, just vanished, leaving everything behind." She hesitated, glancing at the ground as if remembering something she'd tried to bury. "Maggie," Alex urged gently, "what happened to his family?" Her gaze met his, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed endless. "They say his child was never found. Some say, well, some believe the child is still there, crying, calling out for someone who'll never come." Maggie's words left Alex shaken. He thanked her and returned to the house, his mind racing with horrific possibilities. That night, the cries returned, louder than ever, seeping through the floorboards, haunting every corner of the house. As he lay in bed, he wondered if he was starting to lose his mind, or if he was closer than ever to uncovering a truth no one wanted to face. Haunted by Maggie's revelations, Alex became obsessed with finding proof. His days felt like a blur, each one a bridge to another long night where he would sit by the trapdoor, listening to the cries beneath. The growing urgency gnawed at him, pushing him to search every corner of the basement. One night, while prying at loose boards near the trapdoor, his fingers found a gap. Digging deeper, he uncovered a small, dust-covered journal wedged between two beams. Alex wiped away the grime, the leather cover cracked and worn, pages yellowed with age. Inside, the handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries growing more frenzied as he turned each page. The journal belonged to Harold Cartwright, and the first few entries were mundane, a man's account of small-town life, solitary but harmless. But as Alex read on, the entries took a dark turn. Harold wrote of whispers that filled his nights, of a shadow child he kept locked away to purify the house, a child he believed was cursed. The last few entries were chillingly explicit, detailing Harold's descent into paranoia and guilt. He wrote of locking his child in the cellar, hoping to rid himself of the curse. It became clear that Harold saw the child not as his son, but as something twisted, a mistake, a punishment. Closing the journal, Alex felt a surge of nausea. The crying from below seemed to intensify, as though it knew he'd unearthed its painful secret. The realization struck him hard. The child had been abandoned here, sealed away in life and death. The sobs weren't just echoes. They were memories, fragments of an innocent life trapped in endless agony. Alex couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harold's journal entries, the ramblings of a man driven to cruelty by his own fears. The crying seemed louder now, almost deafening in the dead of night, as if the spirit of the child was responding to the awakening of its tragic story. Desperate for clarity, Alex brought the journal to his friend Ben, hoping he could offer an objective perspective. But as Ben skimmed through the pages, his face turned a shade paler, his usual skepticism replaced with shock. "This is dark, Alex. But it doesn't mean there's a ghost. Maybe your mind is filling in the blanks, you know." But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the cries were real. That night, alone in the house, he finally confronted the trapdoor again. Kneeling down, he placed his ear against the wood, feeling his pulse race. The cries had transformed into shrieks, a pleading intensity that echoed through the walls. The house itself seemed to react, lights flickering and a frigid chill filling the air. In the small hours of the morning, Alex felt himself break. "What do you want?" he whispered to the empty air. He stayed there listening, his voice shaking, until a distinct feeling washed over him, an invitation. The cries had ceased, replaced by a dense silence, as if waiting for him to take the next step. Exhausted, Alex returned to bed, but the sleep that finally came was full of fragmented nightmares, visions of a child trapped, begging to be saved. When he woke, he felt as though he were under the weight of a promise, a responsibility he hadn't agreed to but felt bound to fulfill. Alex's obsession had reached a breaking point. He could no longer sit back and listen to the cries without acting. Determined to reach whatever lay below, he gathered every tool he could find, prying and hammering at the trapdoor with relentless focus. After hours of struggle, the lock finally gave way with a loud crack. The air that rose from the trapdoor was damp and cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and decay. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, barely visible beyond the first few steps. Alex's stomach churned, but he knew he had to go down. Flashlight in hand, he began his descent, the creaking of each step adding to the oppressive silence. As he moved further, his light revealed remnants of old toys, dust-covered and broken, scattered along the stairs. Dolls with blank eyes, toy soldiers missing limbs, fragments of a life that had been abandoned. At the bottom, the room opened up into a low-ceilinged cellar. The walls were bare stone, damp and uneven. His flashlight caught rusty chains bolted to the far wall, their purpose disturbingly clear. Alex's breath hitched as he stepped closer, feeling the weight of the child's suffering fill the room. He couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't just an echo of the past. The energy in the cellar was thick, pressing down on him like a palpable force. As he reached out to touch the wall, a faint whimper filled the air. It was soft but unmistakably there, a sound that sent chills racing up his spine. He withdrew his hand, heart pounding as he realized he was standing in the very place where Harold's child had suffered and died. Shaken and horrified, Alex fled the cellar and made his way to Maggie's house, his mind racing with questions. Maggie answered the door with a look of resignation, as if she knew what he had uncovered. Alex didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "That child you knew, didn't you?" Maggie's face crumpled with grief. She motioned for him to come inside, closing the door softly behind them. "I was there, Alex. I saw what Harold did, but I was young, powerless, and afraid." She spoke in a broken tone, her hands shaking as she recalled the horrors she had witnessed. Maggie revealed that she had been the child's nanny, forced to watch as Harold's mind decayed, turning him into a paranoid man haunted by his own beliefs. He had locked his own child away, convinced the boy was tainted. Maggie had tried to leave, but Harold had threatened her, trapping her in his twisted world. Tears filled her eyes. "I wanted to help him, Alex. But Harold, he was too far gone. He believed he was saving us, that by trapping the boy, he was purging evil from the world. I knew I'd never forgive myself, so I stayed, hoping one day I'd find a way to help." Alex felt a surge of anger and pity. Maggie's regret was real, but her fear had kept her from acting. In that moment, he realized that the spirit wasn't just reaching out for help. It was calling for justice, for someone to remember the agony it had endured. "I'm going to free him, Maggie," he said with quiet determination. "That child deserves peace, and I'll find a way to give it to him." Maggie only nodded, her gaze haunted. "Just be careful, Alex. Some things, once disturbed, can never be put back to rest." Alex's determination to free the child's spirit grew stronger, but so did the sense of dread that seemed to cling to every corner of the house. Each night, as he lay awake, the sounds from beneath the floor grew louder, the cries transforming into enraged shrieks. It was as if the spirit could sense his intentions and was fighting against them, stirring up a storm of fear and unease. The disturbances escalated, making his once quiet home feel hostile and alive. Furniture creaked as if shifting on its own, lights flickered unpredictably, and doors swung open or slammed shut without warning. The spirit was angry, and Alex felt like an intruder in his own home. It was clear that his plan to release the child's spirit was unsettling whatever energy lingered in the house. Unable to bear the torment alone, he reached out to Ben again. Despite his lingering skepticism, Ben agreed to help, concerned by Alex's deteriorating state. Together, they prepared for the ritual they'd found in the journal, a desperate attempt to communicate with the child and bring it peace. That night, the house was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The two men sat in the dim basement, surrounded by candles, their soft light casting long shadows on the walls. As they began the ritual, Alex felt a chill run through him, as though an unseen presence had settled beside him. His voice shook as he called out to the spirit, pleading for its release. The silence grew oppressive, suffocating. Then, without warning, a scream erupted from beneath the floor, raw and agonizing, reverberating through the basement. The candles flickered violently, and the air grew thick, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Ben's face paled, his hands shaking as he watched in horror. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind swept through the room, snuffing out the candles, and they were left in complete darkness. The ritual had failed, and Alex realized with dawning terror that he had only managed to provoke the spirit further. With the spirit's rage now tangible and overwhelming, Alex knew he couldn't continue alone. He was desperate for answers, for someone who could help him understand what he had awakened. In his search, he discovered an obscure paranormal expert a few towns over, someone known for dealing with haunted places and restless spirits. Reluctantly, he reached out. When she arrived, a woman named Dr. Lillian Hayes, she was as calm and confident as Alex was shaken. She surveyed the house quietly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, every shadow. Her presence alone was reassuring, a steadying force in the turmoil that had engulfed his life. Dr. Hayes listened as Alex recounted the history of the house, the journal entries, and the events he had experienced. She nodded thoughtfully, her expression grave. Spirits like this, especially ones tied to intense trauma, don't leave easily, she explained. They hold on to pain, onto anger. The child's suffering is bound to hear, and it won't leave until it feels a true release. They returned to the basement, where Dr. Hayes placed talismans around the room, symbols of protection and peace. She instructed Alex to repeat the ritual but warned him that this time he would need to make a personal sacrifice, something deeply meaningful to him, as a gesture of empathy and understanding. As night fell, Alex sat alone in the basement once more, a family heirloom in his hands, his mother's old locket, the one piece of family history he'd brought with him. It was precious, a reminder of his roots and the love he had left behind. Dr. Hayes assured him that offering it would help bridge the divide between the living and the dead, conveying the respect and reverence that the child's spirit needed to feel. With a deep breath, Alex began the ritual again, clutching the locket as he called to the spirit. The room grew cold, the air thick with a heavy, sorrowful presence. As he placed the locket on the floor, he felt the spirit's energy shift, its rage softening, giving way to a profound sadness. The child's cries turned to soft whimpers, a final plea for release. Alex's heart ached as he whispered, "You're free now. You're not alone." The locket glimmered faintly before it dimmed, and the air grew still. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. The oppressive energy had lifted, and Alex dared to believe that the ritual had worked. Yet, something didn't feel entirely resolved. There was an emptiness that lingered, a nagging sense that he had missed a vital piece of the puzzle. Unable to shake this feeling, Alex began searching the house again, hoping for one last clue. While sifting through old papers in a forgotten drawer, he stumbled upon a letter hidden behind a loose board. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was another letter from Harold Cartwright, but this one was different. Instead of the erratic scrawls in his journal, these words were clear, deliberate. The letter was a confession of sorts, written in the final days before Harold vanished. It revealed the depths of his belief that the child, his own son, was cursed. Driven by paranoia, Harold had convinced himself that the boy's mere presence brought misfortune. But buried within the letter was a haunting truth. Maggie had known all along about Harold's plans to imprison the child. She had assisted him, albeit reluctantly, convincing herself that she was sparing the town from a greater evil. Alex felt a wave of anger and betrayal. Maggie, who had acted as though she were an innocent bystander, had been complicit in this tragedy. She had allowed the suffering of an innocent child, all under the guise of protecting the town. Armed with this knowledge, Alex knew he had to confront her one last time. Alex stormed over to Maggie's house, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and disbelief. She opened the door, her face weary but guarded, as if she knew what was coming. Without preamble, he held up the letter, watching her expression shift from defensiveness to defeat. "Why, Maggie?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "You knew all along. You helped him. You chose to let that child suffer." Maggie's shoulders slumped, her face etched with guilt. She admitted that she had been young and afraid, and that Harold's influence over her was powerful. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, voice breaking. "He convinced me the child was a threat to all of us. I was weak." Her confession left Alex cold. The quiet town he'd come to trust felt foreign, and even Maggie, who had once seemed so kind and knowing, was tarnished by this horrific secret. He realized he couldn't trust anyone here, not fully. His heart ached for the child who had endured so much suffering in silence, betrayed not just by a father, but by everyone around him. Without a word, Alex turned away, leaving Maggie standing in the doorway, her frail frame sagging with the weight of her actions. He returned to his house, feeling an overwhelming isolation. The town felt like a cage, with its secrets and lies closing in around him. That night, Alex sat alone in the empty house, grappling with the enormity of what he'd uncovered. He was haunted not just by the child's suffering, but by the realization that everyone had failed him. In that quiet, empty space, Alex understood that he was now part of this legacy, a keeper of its truth, burdened by the ghosts of its past. The weight of betrayal and isolation bore down on Alex, leaving him feeling hollow. His mind replayed Maggie's confession, her words echoing in the silence of the house. He had come to this town seeking peace and a fresh start, but now he was bound by a dark legacy he hadn't chosen. He felt like he was losing his grip, as if the house itself were pulling him into the same madness that had consumed Harold. The crying returned that night, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from beneath the floor, nor was it confined to a single part of the house. It seemed to come from everywhere, filling each room, each corner, with the haunting sound of a child's weeping. Alex's heart raced as he moved from room to room, trying to locate the source, but it was elusive, slipping away just as he drew near. At the end of his search, exhausted and desperate, Alex collapsed onto the floor, overcome with a crushing sense of failure. He realized that despite everything he'd done, he hadn't been able to bring peace to the child's spirit. Instead, he had only stirred up its suffering, amplifying its cries. His efforts felt futile, and he began to question whether he had made things worse. The night stretched on, the crying intensifying into a harrowing wail that seemed to echo his own despair. For the first time, Alex felt powerless, unsure of how to proceed or if he even had the strength to continue. This was his lowest moment, a realization that he might not be able to save the child or himself from the weight of this house's dark history. At dawn, as the faint light began to creep into the house, Alex felt a renewed determination rise within him. He couldn't abandon the spirit, not after coming this far. Summoning the last of his resolve, he prepared for one final confrontation, believing that if he failed, the house's darkness would consume him entirely. He returned to the cellar, bringing the remnants of Harold's journal and the family heirloom, his mother's locket, along with him. Kneeling at the center of the room, he called out to the spirit once more, this time with a gentleness and understanding he hadn't shown before. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I couldn't protect you, but I'm here now. You're not alone." The room grew icy, shadows lengthening as if the house itself were watching. The spirit's presence thickened around him, a dense, suffocating energy pressing down on his shoulders. Alex felt himself grow weaker, the air heavy with anger and sorrow. But he didn't back down. Instead, he offered the locket, placing it on the ground as a final gesture of peace. In that moment, the room seemed to pulse, the very walls vibrating with a low hum. The child's form appeared faintly, shimmering in the air like a mirage. For the first time, Alex could see him, a small, fragile figure, eyes wide with confusion and pain. Alex's heart broke as he reached out, not to touch, but to comfort. "You're free now," he said softly. "You don't have to stay here anymore." The spirit looked at him, its expression softening, the pain easing from its face. As the room brightened, the child's form began to dissolve, its presence fading into a warm, gentle light that washed over Alex, filling him with a profound sense of peace. The energy in the house shifted, the lingering darkness lifting as the child's spirit found its release. The house was finally silent, its walls no longer filled with the echoes of suffering. Alex, exhausted but relieved, made his way upstairs, feeling a calm settle over him for the first time since he had arrived. The house was quiet, but the weight of its history lingered, and Alex could feel the last traces of the darkness that had once filled its walls. He walked through each room, noting how different it felt. A sense of lightness replaced the dread that had once pervaded the space. It was as though the house itself had been freed along with the child's spirit. Though he felt a deep sense of relief, he knew there was still a lingering sadness, a residual presence from years of pain. To truly lift the house's curse, he realized he had to share the truth with the townspeople, bringing the story of the forgotten child to light. Only then would the memory of what happened here find its proper place. That afternoon, Alex went to the town square and spoke to the few people who would listen. He recounted the story of Harold and his tragic obsession, the child who had been unjustly condemned and hidden away. As he spoke, he felt the eyes of the townspeople widen in shock and disbelief. Their faces reflected a mix of horror and sorrow, a collective reckoning with the past they had ignored. Some dismissed him, too disturbed by the idea of such darkness in their peaceful town. But others stayed, listening with a quiet reverence, moved by the tragedy he laid before them. By the end of his tale, there was an unspoken understanding among those who remained. The child's suffering had finally been acknowledged, the silence surrounding it broken. With the story told and the house's secrets exposed, Alex returned to his home feeling a strange mixture of closure and exhaustion. The burden he had carried since discovering the child's cries felt lighter, as though he had finally done right by the spirit. The house, once filled with haunting energies, was now quiet, peaceful, a place of rest rather than torment. The townspeople began to speak of the house differently, no longer as a place to be feared, but as a reminder of how shadows could fester when the truth was buried. Some even visited, leaving small flowers and tokens near the door as a quiet tribute to the child who had been wronged. The house became a symbol of redemption, a lesson in acknowledging even the darkest parts of history. For Alex, the experience had changed him profoundly. He had come to this town to escape his own pain, hoping to find peace in solitude. But instead, he found himself facing a legacy of suffering, his courage tested and his heart opened. He learned the importance of facing uncomfortable truths, even when doing so left scars. As he prepared to leave, Alex looked back at the house one last time, feeling a sense of gratitude for all it had taught him. He knew he would carry its story with him, a reminder of his journey and the spirit he had freed. As he drove away, a soft, warm light glowed in the window, a quiet farewell from a soul finally at rest. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us bring you more of these spine-chilling tales. Let us know in the comments, what part of the screams beneath the floor impacted you the most? Was it the haunting cries, the shocking discoveries, or the final release of the spirit? And if you have any story ideas or themes you'd love to see next, Drop your suggestions below. We can't wait to explore the stories that keep you up at night.